The late October wind carried the scent of fallen leaves as the Henderson family's car rolled up the gravel drive to their new home in Salem, Massachusetts. Victorian mansion loomed ahead, its spires piercing the gray sky like jagged teeth. Mark Henderson gripped the steering wheel, his eyes bright with anticipation. A history professor with a passion for the past, he'd spent years dreaming of a place like this, a house dripping with stories. Laura, his wife, leaned forward in the passenger seat, her artist hands itching to sketch the ivy-clad turrets and warped window panes. In the back seat, Emily, their 16-year-old daughter, scrolled through her phone, feigning disinterest, though her sharp gaze darted to the house. Beside her, 12-year-old Ben clutched his sketchbook, his wide eyes tracing the shadows that clung to the mansion's edges. The front door creaked open, revealing a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase and walls paneled in dark wood. Sunlight streamed through stained-glass windows, casting fractured rainbows across the dusty floor. Laura inhaled deeply, the musty air sparking her imagination. "It's perfect," she murmured, stepping inside. Mark followed, hauling a suitcase, while the kids bolted upstairs, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The house seemed to sigh as they entered, its bones settling under their weight. A cold draft snaked through the rooms, tugging at their clothes, but Mark waved it off. "Old houses breathe," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. By afternoon, they'd claimed their spaces. Emily chose a corner room with a view of the tangled garden, its walls papered in faded roses. Ben picked a smaller room with a slanted ceiling, drawn to the way the light bent through its single window. Laura and Mark took the master suite downstairs, its massive four-poster bed draped in Moffaton velvet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily slipped away to explore, her curiosity pulling her toward the attic. The narrow staircase groaned under her weight, and the air grew thick with the scent of mildew. At the top, she found a locked door, its brass knob icy to the touch. With a hairpin from her pocket, she jimmied it open, revealing a cluttered space piled with trunks and cobwebs. Among the debris, a small leather-bound book caught her eye. She brushed off decades of dust and opened it, the spine cracking faintly. The first page bore a date 1692 and a trembling script. "The trials have begun. They call me a witch, but I am innocent." Emily's pulse quickened. She flipped ahead, reading snippets of a woman's life unraveling. "The townsfolk whisper my name, Abigail Blackwood. They see evil where there is none." The final entry was a furious scrawl. "They will pay. My spirit will not rest." Emily tucked the diary under her arm, her mind buzzing with questions, and descended back to her room, the weight of the words lingering. That night, the house came alive in subtle ways. Ben jolted awake, his blankets tangled, certain he'd heard whispers soft, overlapping voices that faded when he strained to listen. He crept to his door, peering into the hall, but saw only darkness. Downstairs, Laura stirred at the sound of creaking floorboards, her breath catching as she convinced herself it was the house settling. In the foyer, Mark wrestled with a rusted keyhole on the basement door, a stubborn barrier he couldn't breach. "We'll deal with it tomorrow," he muttered, though a flicker of unease gnawed at him. Emily, meanwhile, lay awake, the diary's pages rustling in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching. As the family drifted into fitful sleep, the mansion stood silent, its stained glass glowing faintly under the moon. The wind rattled the windows, and deep within the walls, a presence stirred, patient and unyielding. The Hendersons had arrived, but they were not alone. The past had been waiting, and now it was awake. The days blurred into a strange routine as the Henderson family tried to settle into their new life in Salem. The house, with its creaking floors and drafty halls, refused to let them feel at ease. Lights flickered at odd hours, and the whispers Ben had heard on their first night grew louder, threading through the walls like a spider's web. Mark, ever the rationalist, blamed faulty wiring and old pipes, but even he couldn't explain the faint, overlapping voices that seemed to echo in the silence. One morning, while unpacking boxes in the living room, Laura noticed a cold spot near the fireplace. She reached out, her hand trembling, and felt an icy draft that sent a shiver down her spine. "Mark, come feel this," she called, but by the time he arrived, the air had warmed. He smiled indulgently, chalking it up to her imagination, but Laura's unease lingered. That night, she dreamed of a woman in a black cloak, her face obscured, standing at the foot of her bed. She woke gasping, her heart pounding, but the room was empty. Emily, meanwhile, became engrossed in Abigail's diary. She spent hours in her room poring over the brittle pages, her empathy for the accused which deepening with each entry. Abigail's words painted a vivid picture of a woman wronged and betrayed by her neighbors, condemned by a town gripped by fear. "They see evil where there is none," one entry read. "My only crime is being different." Emily felt a strange kinship with Abigail, a sense that their stories were intertwined. She began to sketch the woman's face, imagining her as a kindred spirit trapped in the past. Determined to learn more, Emily visited the local library, where she met Mr. Thompson, a retired historian with a kind smile and a wealth of knowledge about Salem's dark history. Over tea in his cluttered office, he listened intently as she described the diary. Abigail Blackwood, he mused, his eyes narrowing. A tragic figure, accused of witchcraft, but the evidence was flimsy at best. She was burned at the stake by order of Judge William Henderson, a man known for his ruthlessness. He paused, studying Emily's face. "Your family's name is Henderson, isn't it?" Emily's stomach twisted. "Yes, but we're not related. Are we?" Mr. Thompson's silence was answer enough. He handed her a faded document, a family tree, linking the Hendersons of Salem to Judge William himself. "Be careful," he warned as she left, clutching the paper. "The past has a way of haunting the present." Back home, the house seemed to sense the family's growing unease. Doors that had been left open were found shut, and Ben swore he saw shadows moving in the corners of his room. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. They rushed to find Emily's sketch of Abigail torn to shreds, the pieces scattered across the floor. "I didn't do this," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Mark tried to rationalize it, a gust of wind, perhaps, but the windows were closed, the air still. That night, Ben woke to a soft tapping at his window. He peered out, his breath fogging the glass, and saw a figure in the garden, a woman in a black cloak, her face hidden. She raised a hand, beckoning him, and he stumbled back, terrified. "Mom," he screamed, and Laura rushed in, pulling him close. "It was just a dream," she soothed, though her own hands shook. But when she glanced out the window, she saw a faint mist curling around the trees, dissipating into the night. The next day, Mark decided to investigate the basement, the one door they hadn't yet opened. He wrestled with the rusted lock until it gave way, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like old blood. He descended cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. At the bottom, he found a small room, its walls lined with strange symbols etched into the stone. In the center lay a wooden chest, its lid sealed with a heavy padlock. As he reached for it, a voice whispered in his ear, sharp and insistent, "Leave it." He spun around, but the room was empty. Heart pounding, he fled upstairs, slamming the door behind him. The family gathered in the living room, their faces pale. "Something's wrong with this house," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark, his skepticism wavering, nodded slowly. "We need to find out more about Abigail Blackwood," he agreed. Mel, clutching the diary, felt a surge of determination. "I think she's trying to tell us something," she said. "Maybe she needs our help." As night fell, the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The Hendersons were no longer just occupants, they were players in a story centuries old. And the witch's curse was only beginning to unfold. The Henderson family's attempts to rationalize the strange occurrences in their new home crumbled as the supernatural events grew more intense and undeniable. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and the presence of Abigail Blackwood's spirit became a palpable force, no longer content to whisper from the shadows. It began with small, inexplicable incidents. Doors that had been left open were found slammed shut, the sound echoing through the halls like a gunshot. Mirrors, once reflecting the family's uneasy faces, cracked in jagged webs, as if struck by an unseen hand. The air grew heavy with a sense of menace, and the family's sleep was fractured by nightmares that left them drenched in sweat and dread. One evening, as Emily walked past the grand staircase, a portrait of a stern-faced man, Judge William Henderson. She realized with a start, crashed to the floor, glass splintering at her feet. She jumped back, heart pounding, and stared at the painting. The judge's eyes seemed to bore into her, accusing and cold. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. But the house answered with a low, rumbling groan that made the floorboards tremble. Laura's nightmares took on a terrifying clarity. She dreamed of flames licking at her feet, of a woman's screams piercing the darkness, and of a crowd chanting for blood. She woke one night to find her arms covered in scratches, thin red lines that stung to the touch. "Mark, look at this," she said, her voice trembling. He examined the marks, his brow furrowed. "Maybe you did it in your sleep," he suggested weakly, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. Desperate for answers, Emily returned to Mr. Thompson, the local historian. Over a cup of tea in his cluttered office, she recounted the escalating events. His face grew grave as he listened. "There's something you need to know," he said, pulling out a faded document. "Your family is directly descended from Judge William Henderson, the man who condemned Abigail to death." Emily's stomach dropped. "So, the curse? It's real?" she asked. Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. "Abigail swore vengeance on his lineage. If her spirit is still bound to the house, she might see you as targets." Back at the mansion, the family gathered in the living room, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy in the air. Laura, her voice raw with fear, turned to Mark. "We need to leave," she pleaded. "This isn't just a story anymore. It's dangerous." But Mark, his scholarly pride battling his growing unease, shook his head. "We can't run from the past," he insisted. "There has to be a way to make this right." That night, a blood-curdling scream tore through the house. The family rushed to Ben's room, where they found him curled in a ball, sobbing. "She was here," he whimpered, pointing at the window. "The witch." Laura pulled him close, her heart breaking, while Mark checked the window. It was fogged, and as he watched, a faint handprint appeared on the glass, then slowly faded away. The house no longer hid its malice. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, and the whispers turned to growls, low and threatening. Objects moved on, their own books flew off shelves, chairs skidded across the floor. And the basement door, once locked, now creaked open invitingly, as if daring them to descend. Emily, clutching Abigail's diary, felt a surge of determination. "Maybe she's trying to communicate," she said. "Maybe she needs us to understand." Mark, his skepticism waning, nodded. "Let's try to learn more about her," he agreed. Together, they pored over the diary and the documents from Mr. Thompson, piecing together Abigail's tragic story. But as they delved deeper, the house reacted violently. The lights flickered, and a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. A voice, sharp and furious, echoed in their minds. "You cannot undo what was done." The family huddled together, fear etched on their faces as the realization sank in. They were not just living in a haunted house. They were caught in the crosshairs of a centuries-old curse, and Abigail Blackwood's wrath was only beginning to unfold. The Henderson family's grip on reality began to fray as Abigail Blackwood's spirit tightened its hold on the mansion. The house, once a symbol of their dreams, had become a prison of nightmares, its walls echoing with the witch's fury. Each day brought new horrors, and the family's unity splintered under the strain. Emily awoke one morning to a searing pain across her back. She stumbled to the mirror, gasping at the sight of 3 deep scratches, red and raw as if clawed by an unseen hand. Hours later, Ben vanished from the living room, only to be found hours later, locked in the basement, his eyes wide with terror. He babbled about a woman in black who whispered threats in his ear, her voice like ice. Mark, his face haggard, pored over old documents, confirming their lineage and the curse's grim promise. His obsession with unraveling the mystery consumed him, while Laura's pleas to leave fell on deaf ears. "We're leaving," Laura demanded one evening, her voice breaking as she packed a suitcase. "This house is killing us." Mark, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, refused. "We can't run," he insisted, clutching a stack of notes. "I'm close to finding a way to end this." Laura's gaze hardened. "You're not the only one suffering, Mark. Look at your children." But he turned away, lost in his own world of guilt and determination. Emily, meanwhile, discovered a hidden room in the attic, its door concealed behind a false wall. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the walls were etched with strange symbols, runes of protection and binding. At the center of the room lay a small leather-bound book, Abigail's grimoire, its pages filled with spells and incantations. One spell caught her eye: to bind a spirit. She showed it to Mark, who seized it as their salvation. This could trap her, he said, his voice trembling with hope. They gathered the necessary items: candles, salt, herbs from the garden, and began the ritual in the living room, their hands shaking as they formed a circle. Mark chanted the incantation, his voice growing stronger with each word. For a moment, the house seemed to still, the air thickening with anticipation. Then, with a deafening roar, the house rebelled. Windows rattled, furniture spun across the floor, and a voice thundered through the walls: "You cannot bind me." The candles snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness, and Abigail's presence surged, a wave of cold that froze them in place. Ben's eyes rolled back, and his small body convulsed. When he spoke, it was with Abigail's voice, twisted and cruel. "You will suffer as I did," Laura screamed, pulling him into her arms, but his gaze remained vacant, possessed. Mark, his face ashen, tried to continue the chant, but the words faltered on his lips. The house shook violently, and a chandelier crashed to the floor, shattering inches from where they stood. In the chaos, Emily grabbed the grimoire, her fingers trembling as she flipped through its pages. "There has to be another way," she muttered, her mind racing. She found a passage about atonement, about righting the wrongs of the past. "Maybe we need to apologize," she said, her voice barely audible over the din. Maybe that's what she wants. Laura, cradling Ben, nodded through her tears. "We have to try." Together, they knelt in the center of the room, their voices rising in unison. "Abigail Blackwood, we're sorry for what was done to you. We're not your enemies. Please, forgive us." For a heartbeat, the house fell silent, the air heavy with expectation. Then, with a shriek that pierced their souls, Abigail's spirit lashed out, hurling Emily across the room. She hit the wall with a sickening thud, crumpling to the floor. The family rushed to her side, their hearts pounding. Emily groaned, dazed but alive, as the house settled into an eerie calm. They had faced the witch's wrath and survived, but the cost was mounting. Mark, his resolve shattered, finally admitted, "We can't stay here." But as they looked around, the doors slammed shut, the locks clicking into place. The house had other plans. Trapped and desperate, the Hendersons realized that escape was no longer an option. They would have to confront Abigail's spirit head-on, or risk losing everything to her vengeance. The Henderson family stood in the aftermath of Abigail's fading presence, the silence of the house almost deafening after the chaos. Mark clutched the locket tightly, its cold metal pressing into his palm. "Her grave," he said, breaking the stillness. "We need to find it. Tonight." Laura adjusted her grip on Ben, who clung to her, his small frame trembling. "The woods behind the house, it's the only place that makes sense. She was an outcast. They wouldn't have buried her in the town cemetery." Emily nodded, rubbing her bruised shoulder. "The diary mentioned a clearing with a twisted oak. That's where we start." They gathered what they needed: flashlights, a shovel from the garage, and the grimoire, its pages still open to the spell of release. The night air was crisp as they stepped outside, the moon casting long shadows through the skeletal trees. The woods loomed ahead, a tangled mass of branches and undergrowth, whispering with the wind. Mark led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Emily stayed close, her eyes scanning for the twisted oak, while Laura kept Ben near, murmuring reassurances. The deeper they went, the thicker the air grew, as if the forest itself resisted their intrusion. Twigs snapped underfoot, and an owl's hoot pierced the quiet, making Ben jump. After what felt like hours, Emily spotted a gnarled, ancient oak, its branches curling like claws against the sky. "There," she called, pointing. They hurried forward, their lights converging on a small clearing. In the center, barely visible beneath moss and dirt, was a weathered stone, unmarked but unmistakably a grave. "This has to be it," Mark said, setting the grimoire down. He began digging, the shovel biting into the earth with a dull thud. The family watched in tense silence, the pile of soil growing beside the hole. Sweat beaded on Mark's forehead despite the chill, and Laura knelt to help, scraping away dirt with her hands. Finally, the shovel struck something hard, a wooden box, rotted and crumbling. Mark pried it open, revealing a scattering of bones, brittle and gray with age. "Abigail," he whispered, placing the locket gently among them. "We're keeping our promise." Emily took the grimoire, her voice steady as she began the spell of release once more. "Abigail Blackwood, with this act, we honor you. We return what was yours and free you from your pain. Rest now, and let the curse be lifted." The words hung in the air, and a soft glow emanated from the locket, spreading over the bones. The ground trembled faintly, and a sigh like a breath long held rustled through the trees. The glow faded, and the air lightened, the oppressive weight lifting from their shoulders. Ben looked up at Laura, his eyes wide but calm. "Is she gone, Mom?" All smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. "I think so, sweetheart. I think she's finally at peace." Mark covered the grave, smoothing the soil with care. The family stood together, their breaths visible in the cold night, a sense of closure settling over them. The curse was broken, but the woods remained silent, as if watching, waiting. As they turned back toward the house, a faint whisper carried on the wind, "Thank you," so soft they might have imagined it. They didn't look back. The Henderson family trudged back to the mansion through the pre-dawn mist, their flashlight beams wavering as exhaustion set in. The burial of Abigail Blackwood's locket in her grave had lifted a weight from their shoulders, and the oppressive silence of the woods gave way to a fragile peace. As they crossed the threshold, the house felt different, still and empty, the air no longer thick with malice. Mark dropped the shovel by the door, his hands trembling from the night's labor. Dull da 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 da. Laura guided Ben to the couch, where he curled up, his sketchbook clutched tightly. Emily sank into a chair, the grimoire resting on her lap, its pages now silent. For the first time in weeks, they slept deeply, the nightmares receding like a tide. When morning broke on August 4th, 2025, sunlight streamed through the cracked windows, painting the rooms in warm hues. Mark woke first, his mind clearer than it had been in months. He found Laura in the kitchen, brewing coffee, her eyes red but resolute. "We made it," she said softly, and he nodded, the guilt of his stubbornness still lingering. Emily emerged, her shoulders stiff from the fall, and joined them with a tired smile. "I think she's gone," she said, glancing at the grimoire. The diary had a new word this morning, "forgiven." She showed them the page, where the ink shimmered faintly, a silent testament to their efforts. Ben, rubbing sleep from his eyes, added, "I didn't hear her last night. Not once." The family decided to stay, transforming the hidden attic room into a tribute to Abigail. They painted the walls white, framing the symbols with care, and placed the diary on a small shelf alongside a candle. "It's her story now," Laura said, her voice steady. "We won't let it be forgotten." Mark agreed, his historian's heart finding purpose in documenting Abigail's tale, while Emily sketched a portrait of the woman she'd come to understand. Days turned into weeks, and the house settled into a quiet rhythm. The flickering lights stopped, the doors stayed where they were left, and the basement door remained open, revealing only damp stone and cobwebs. But the past wasn't entirely gone. Ben sometimes paused, tilting his head as if catching a whisper, though he never spoke of it. Emily felt cold drafts in the attic, a gentle presence rather than a threat. And Mark noticed the occasional creak of floorboards late at night, a reminder of the house's long memory. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, a soft breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Ben looked up from his sketchbook, where he'd drawn a woman in a black cloak, her face peaceful. "Do you think she's watching us?" he asked. Laura squeezed his hand. "Maybe," she said, "but not to hurt us, to thank us." Mark set down his notes, a faint smile breaking through. "We've given her peace and she's given us a chance to heal." The words felt true, yet a shadow of doubt lingered. The house had a history, and history he knew never fully let go. As midnight approached, Emily stood in the attic, the candle flickering beside the diary. She traced the word "forgiven" with her finger, feeling a subtle warmth. The room seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, and for a moment, She thought she saw a figure vague, an ethereal nodding, in approval before fading into the shadows. The Hendersons had survived the witch's curse, their bond forged stronger through the ordeal. They turned the mansion into a home, its creaks and drafts now part of their lives. But late at night, when the moon hung low over Salem, they couldn't shake the sense that Abigail Blackwood lingered not as a vengeful spirit, but as a quiet guardian, her story entwined with theirs forever.